Good morning. I'm Dan Engling. Like Tim said, I'm a CIH, and I run our industrial hygiene and health safety division. We call it Safety and Industrial Health. We're going to talk about national emphasis programs, why it's important right now, why these particular national emphasis programs, or NEPs, that we're going to go over are important to most facilities that are probably represented in this room. And then from there, we'll kind of get into some of the solutions that we're seeing, some of the things that have been pretty effective. So why national emphasis programs? What are national emphasis programs, or NEPs? It's basically a way for OSHA to formally reallocate resources to target a specific type of regulation or a specific type of hazard or a specific industry group or different sectors. And you'll see how they kind of divide it out in different ways here in a little bit. But basically, an NEP is a way to say, we normally have a schedule for programmed audits, as they call it, things that are as a part of their regular structure throughout the year. But we're going to prioritize that in a little different way. We're going to shift it and put more resources to one type of hazard and less resources to one that we think is less important for this year or these 4 years that this thing is assigned to. And I say that in a kind of a localized context or a short time window context, but some of these NEPs have been in play since the early 2000s. For example, I believe the combustible dust one we're going to talk about is since 2003. The problem is that a lot of people kind of become familiar with it because they see it on the list of NEPs over time, but they change these things. They're in place, yes, but they change them over time, and they become, sometimes they add more teeth to them, or sometimes they change the direction that it's going to take, and they're looking at a different thing the following year. So recent challenges and solutions for KERAMIDA clients is the first thing we're going to talk about. New regulations headed down the pike that are associated with some of these NEPs, and then preparation for OSHA site visits as a response to what we're seeing here. So we're going to talk about 4. There are 13 in play right now, 13 NEPs on the national scale. There can be some state programs, all right? So some state emphasis programs that state-run OSHA programs want to target. But for the most part, the national emphasis programs are kept to between 10 and 15 at any given point in time. Right now there are 13, but combustible dust, the first we're going to talk about. And they say that the purpose of this is to inspect facilities that generate or handle combustible dusts that are likely to cause fire, flash fire, deflagration, and or explosion hazards. Second one is process safety management. So this is PSM. You've probably heard this term before. This is for highly hazardous chemicals above a certain threshold quantity. There are 137 chemicals on this list in Appendix A to the 119 standard, and those are all associated with a specific threshold of weight, and it's all in pounds. So it might be 10,000 pounds, it might be 5,000 pounds, 200 pounds, just depends on the relative toxicity of it or the relative hazard of that specific compound. Then there is another list that is characterized by the way it behaves, right? So that's within the actual standard itself, not a part of the appendices. And you'll find that those are primarily situated around the combustibility or flammability of the material. So you can have, any number of chemicals that are nowhere near being generic enough to be on that 137 list, but you still qualify for PSM because it's flammable, or because it can become explosive, or because it can polymerize, or things like that. The next one, well, in this one, they state, this is OSHA language here, to reduce or eliminate workplace hazards associated with catastrophic release of highly hazardous chemicals at facilities. Now, keep in mind, there are 2 things that are often seen together, PSM and RMP, Process Safety Management and Risk Management Plan from EPA. They're very, very similar. All 14 elements collide, overlap with each other in both standards. There are some minor differences, but the biggest difference is that the EPA is looking for off-site consequences for the most part, and OSHA is looking at employee protection. So if you think of it that way, they become quite different in the way that you actually go about complying with them. The third one, outdoor and indoor heat-related hazards. OSHA says that this targets specific industries expected to have the highest exposures to heat-related hazards and resulting illnesses and deaths. And if you are familiar with this, you find that there is no standard for heat stress right now. There is no OSHA standard for heat stress, but they have an NEP. How do they have an NEP without a standard? Any thoughts on that? How do you cite a violation that doesn't have an OSHA standard? General duty clause. Yeah, and it says it in the NEP, kind of like, watch yourself, we're going to use the NEP or the general duty clause, and here's specifically how we're going to use it. And they have a whole paragraph in there just on the general duty clause and about specifically how they're going to cite people under this NEP legally bound in the general duty clause. So they're taking it seriously. Amputations in manufacturing industries is the last one we're going to talk about. Targets industrial and manufacturing workplaces having machinery and equipment that can potentially cause amputations. That's pretty clear, straightforward. So the combustible dust ones. Why is this important right now? Why are they paying attention to it? Well, from 2013 to 2017, OSHA conducted 2,553 inspections, and so this is federal OSHA, and cited 3,389 violations. Notice that the violations number is bigger than the inspections number. So on average, they're citing more than more often than they are not citing. Let's see, 1,022 from programmed and 2,367 from unprogrammed inspections. And the next slide makes it even more important. So these are the same numbers, 1,022 and, sorry, I mentioned that number. Start here. Programmed inspections, 910 programmed inspections, 1,022 citations. So programmed means that they're going to follow a specific name, a company name, or as a part of a national emphasis program, and they're going to find something in that industry or in that specific business that's on that list. If they find it, they're going to cite it. They're going to cite it how they say they will in the NEP. But that's 1.23 citations per programmed inspection. Program inspection is just because you fall in a certain category. That's not because they have any lead that there's a problem there. It's just basically almost a cold drop-in visit. No one called and complained or anything else, and you still have more than one per visit. Right? So this is important to keep in mind. Over here, we would expect this number to be bigger because unprogrammed inspections are generally things that are a response to complaints, call-ins, things like that, tip line stuff for OSHA. So you already know something's going on, and so that's 1.89 per unprogrammed inspection. So they're taking it seriously. They are citing against these things, and we're definitely seeing it with the citations, including references to consensus standards, which are not OSHA standards, but they're still drawing them in. All right. So KERAMIDA has done 25 full facility DHAs. DHA is a requirement of the combustible dust NFPA 652 standard. So NFPA, National Fire Protection Association, has a standard on this. It's a consensus standard. And Chapter 7 describes exactly what you do or what's ultimately required as an output for a dust hazard analysis or a DHA. So we've done 25 of these. This goes top to bottom in the facility, wall to wall, basically looking at every possible, everything that jumps out at us from a combustibility perspective for materials to an ignitability for equipment. We're looking for qualified igniters. We're looking for credible aeration sources, credible suspension sources, mechanisms, and things like that within the facility. And then quantifying the behavior of the dust in a laboratory setting. All right, so it's a pretty involved thing. Oftentimes, it's multiple facilities on the same campus and moving of material and manipulation of stuff. Also, among those 25, you may see something that looks familiar. All right, there's a lot of different facilities in this room, but look at this. Automotive remanufacturing, plastics molding, basically everything related to plastics. Multiple different kinds of die casting, or of casting. So we have aluminum, sand, green sand, so for iron it'd be green sand, and no-bake type operations. We've done this for both. And in every one of them, save for 2, I think, we have found a degree of combustibility that OSHA would consider hazardous, needing some kind of corrective factor. All right, so it's out there, and it's in a lot of industries. Everything from pharmaceutical manufacturing to grain processing. Obviously, this is the big one everyone thinks of. Grain dust, explosions. You see about every year something happens multiple times around the country. Wood products, manufacturing. So it's a broad, sweeping NEP. All right. Process safety management, moving on to this one. Sources for targeting, how are we going to target specific industries in this one, or how is OSHA targeting? Well, they're using, probably not surprisingly because it's so closely paralleled, the RMP, Risk Management Program list. So as a part of RMP, for EPA compliance, facilities that apply to that regulation have to submit a document, have to submit their program, their plan. So EPA knows if you've submitted or not. They know exactly how many facilities that have declared or have been found out to have compliance obligations in this regard. And so OSHA doesn't have that requirement, but they can mine their data and look for the facilities that they should be following up on from a PSM perspective. So the first thing they're doing is they're saying, well, we don't collect the data, but we know someone else who does, and we have the same employer. So we're going to go talk to them within the administration, get that data, and follow up on those facilities, right? So if a facility is an RMP facility, it's not off limits by any stretch for an OSHA inspection under this NEP. Explosives and pyrotechnics industries, that's pretty much a given, but they're following NAICS codes. So speaking of that, they're looking at the OSHA Integrated Management Information System and OSHA's information system internally for facilities, establishments with prior PSM citations. So you've been in trouble in the past, we're going to check on you again. So if you have a history, know that you're also on this targeted list. And then also OSHA area office knowledge of local facilities. And from our experience in this, oftentimes that just looks like, I've been driving by here for a few years and you got a big tank. What is in it? I don't even know what you guys do, but I'm going to knock on the door. And by the way, I'm the OSHA inspector that looks at PSM requirements, but I also look at machine guarding requirements. And I'm also the same guy that looks at confined space requirements. And I'm also the same guy that looks at every one of these other NEPs, right? So having a reason for them to come in the door is not just related to the NEP. Just know that in the back of your mind. But that is specifically listed in their NEP that if an inspector just knows of a facility that might have PSM compliance obligations, they can walk in under this NEP. All right. So then there's some categories. They look through NAICS codes. So one of the obvious ones is things that have ammonia. Ammonia is on that 137 list that I mentioned earlier. And, you know, a lot of power stations have this because they use ammonia for treatment. A lot of food manufacturing facilities have a lot of ammonia and anhydrous ammonia on site because they use it as a working fluid in their cooling systems. So there's a lot of that. Petroleum refineries, not a big surprise. Chemical manufacturing, also not a big surprise. And then NAICS codes for facilities that are likely PSM, but not covered under these categories are under the RMP requirement of EPA. I know there's a lot of acronyms and things in this standard, but this is probably the most sophisticated standard OSHA has, and it gets real hairy real fast. A lot of people spend their whole career just trying to avoid meeting that threshold, finding creative ways to avoid that. So what are we doing? We're doing compliance audits. That's one of the requirements. It's one of the 14 elements of the 119 standard. Compliance audits has to happen every 3 years for every PSM required covered facility. Process hazard analysis, or the PHA, that has to happen every 5 years. So this is an involved process that looks at how you can go from your design specs to an emergency. So basically anything from where it's supposed to operate to any kind of divergent condition. So that's a valve burning out, everything from things as simple as, what happens if this more critical bolt fails to what happens if this line fails. Are you following up on your cause and effect diagrams? Do you have them? Can we make them? Is when you look at failure mode and effects analysis, for example, that's a way that you look at the ways that a chemical can end up somewhere where you don't want it to be, or react with something you don't want it to react with. These are all the kinds of things that we look at in PHAs. Process safety information is required before you start the PHA. This is all of your P&IDs, your piping and instrumentation diagrams, your chemical operations laid out in terms of its like fundamental reaction stages and things like that. All that has to be done. We generate a lot of this, so most of the time when we go into a facility, they don't have all of the pieces that they need, and by regulation, you have to have it before you do the PHA, which you have to have. So a lot of times facilities will find themselves in a pickle where they need to have the PHA, but they don't have all the PSI, and they need it now. So we do a lot of time crunched documentation development on a very technical basis. And then full program development. You got to have a program. covers all 14 elements, so we've done a lot of those as well. All right, any Seinfeld fans? Let's talk about the heat-related hazards NEP. All right, for the inspections, there's very little instruction in the NEP. It doesn't say, like some of the others, it doesn't say how they're gonna want you to cover that as an inspector. It doesn't tell the inspector how they're gonna do it, but it does say that it does make reference to the OSHA technical manual. Okay, so the OSHA technical manual is this huge document, this big book that all the compliance, safety, and health officers have, and it says look at section 3, chapter 4, in which it parks the heat-related illness prevention program and the heat hazard assessment. Now, where am I going to find these requirements in the OSHA standard? Nowhere, right? It doesn't exist. But they still have it here as something that the compliance officer should look for, and if they don't find it, they should cite under the general duty clause. So for all intents and purposes, there is a heat stress standard, right? It's stated right there. What is it if not a standard? If it has, this is what you're looking for, you don't have it, cite it, right? I mean, that's the OSHA Directorate of Enforcement. That's how they operate. So all that said, the condition that we're in right now is basically very little information on exactly what they want to see and what they want to see under certain conditions, but still an enforcement protocol. So I'm hopeful that through the next year, as we see more development of the actual heat stress standard that they're currently working on, I'm hopeful that that clears things up and actually makes it easier for compliance, because right now it's very muddy. So we'll see, we're tracking it very closely, we're part of that process, and we'll see where it goes from here. So the heat-related illness prevention program, it's requiring things like acclimatization, medical monitoring, training, heat alert. These are all things that OSHA is calling out in this NEP. They're also saying that it needs a heat hazard assessment, which requires you to determine wet bulb globe temperature. A lot of people don't even know what that is. It requires a very specialized piece of equipment to measure it. Then they want you to add the clothing adjustment factor to determine the effective wet bulb globe temperature. This involves like direct sunlight radiation, as well as humidity, as well as evaporative cooling effects, air temperature. It's all worked into this big formula, and then that's how you get WBGT. So anyway, that's in there. Determine the metabolic workload. That's not easy to do to a very precise degree. There are mechanisms and methods that we can use to do that, but it can get tricky, but OSHA is requiring it. Determine the threshold limit value or action limit, and that threshold limit value is actually a term from a non-OSHA entity that they're adopting for this purpose. So all this to say, these are probably all, I think this is the best indicator of what that standard is going to require. These last two slides. It's going to be this stuff, and it's going to be this stuff. That's what we're going to see in the OSHA standard, I think, coming in the next couple of years. So be ready for it. You got to develop a standard. Absolutely, we can help you do it. We'd love to help you do it, but just know that that's coming down the pike. The regulatory basis, we talked about this. There's no standard. It's the general duty clause, but they are developing one. And we've been a part of the meetings from the ANPRM, or the Advanced Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. That's a public hearing. We were part of that, 2 of those. We're a part of the American Foundry Society Committee on being responsive to this from the Small Business Regulatory Enforcement Act, which basically, Regulatory Enforcement Fairness Act. Basically, that's a way that it's a check of some kind for OSHA to make sure that they're not, unconstitutionally burdening small companies as opposed to large companies. So we're part of that as well. For the last 2 years, myself and the team have been involved in the development of an international heat stress and heat strain control program for the world's largest oil company. So I've been to Saudi Arabia twice working on this, and it's hot. It's amazing that they don't have it already. So it's like 125 degrees every day in the summertime. And this is the very first time that they've had a heat stress program. All right, and a lot of companies even here do have heat stress programs, certainly not the majority. But why now? Why are they doing this now? There's a couple really interesting things that are happening in the market, specifically on the world stage. Specifically with respect to the Middle East, they are seeing the writing on the wall in terms of carbon-based fuels and things, and they're trying to diversify in every way that they possibly can, whether that's investment stuff or by creating giant cities that are 170 kilometers long so that you could come visit this as a tourist thing. I mean, it's crazy what they're doing. But this is a huge factor that we're seeing underlying all of this. What we're seeing is this protection of people in ways that we've never seen in the Middle East. And I think that what we're going to start seeing is that same idea happening in the US. We're going to see it happening. We already see it happening in the US, but we're going to see it happening in a lot of Western countries more and more as time goes on, that preserving human life is the most important part of their sustainability programs. Okay, so sustainability, Vicki was mentioning this just the other day. Sustainability used to be the middle S of that ESG that they always talk about used to be safety, right? And that's an easier one for us to understand. And the most important factor there is that you are completely unsustainable in your business model if you're killing or hurting people or churning people out or having lots of turnover or making people work less effectively, right? And heat stress is one of the leading factors in that regard. If you're in a hot climate or in the summertime or whatever. So I think we're going to see a lot of this coming up. And obviously OSHA's seeing this to a significant degree as well right now. So keep an eye on it. So I had some pictures and things for all the different other NEPs, but I didn't want to put a picture on for amputations. So I already used one Seinfeld. Oh, you can't really see it. He's getting stuck in a Stairmaster machine. It's George Costanza. Anyway, NEP-driven inspections. Well, what's the process? Category 1, they're looking for, they're selecting industries with high OIS inspection numbers. That means how many times has OSHA been there to inspect for various reasons that industry. OSHA selected 5 standards, so they selected the 147 standard, which is the lockout tagout standard. Pretty clearly, lockout tagout is probably it is the most responsible for amputation injuries, violation of that standard. And then the 212 machine guarding standard, that's cited in here. The 213 woodworking machine standard, the 217 powered mechanical press standard, and the 219 mechanical transmission apparatus standard. All of those are closely related to amputations, right? We see almost, I would say, I'm just kind of shooting off the top of my head here, it's probably close to 80% of all amputations happen as a part of that. The rest of them are things like powered mechanical vehicles, powered industrial vehicles, excavators, things of that nature. All right, so amputation hazards. OSHA used OAS data for calendar years 2015 to 2018 to develop this NEP. And they identified those industries with 40 or more federal OSHA inspections with 1 or more violations per inspection of the selected standards. So these 5 standards, 40 or more federal OSHA inspections with 1 or more violations per inspection. And they came up with 90 5-digit NAICS codes. So that means 90 specific industries have been identified as a part of this NEP based on the violations that they've already seen. So this kind of points back to the very beginning. Why do we see NEPs? Why NEPs? NEPs because we see something as a higher degree of priority. And what makes a higher priority to OSHA? More prevalent violations, higher number of injuries. These are all things that OSHA sees as pretty important to their mission, right? So think of it through their eyes and you see why these 13 are there, but more importantly, why these 4 are here. So there were also, that was category 1. There are also a couple other categories. They all have information under them that I didn't include here in terms of how they're getting to this point. But selection process for industries with high Bureau of Labor Statistic rates, selection process for industries with high BLS amputation numbers specifically, and selection process for industries with higher employer reported amputation numbers. So these are numbers that you can pretty well hang your hat on. If it comes to like a heat stress number, you know that half of those aren't getting coded right at the ER or on the OSHA 300 log. But amputation, it's kind of hard to miss that, right? And in fact, people have tried. And then OSHA rewrote the language to say amputation or loss of an eye. which means somewhere along the line, someone was saying, come on, the loss of an eye isn't an amputation, right? I mean, that's kind of a hard sell. So that's where we're at. OSHA released a projected date, by the way, keep this in mind, of August 2024 for the lockout tagout update notice of proposed rulemaking. So that lockout tagout standard has not been updated in a long time, but it's going to be updated. They say August 2024. I don't believe that as far as I can throw it, but probably going to happen in the next 5 years. It's probably going to start in the next 5 years. How fast they come about a solution for that, I don't know, especially with the administration theoretically changing this next year, I don't know. But the idea is in 2024 or thereabouts, you're going to start this process. The things that they're going to change, and they've kind of made allusions to this, and we've already, if you've been in touch with this, you've seen it coming for a while, the things they're going to change are going to be automated and digital systems, okay? And that is the number one thing that we see people confusing. We see people, you know, were you telling me this? There was a robot. No, it was another, one of our other colleagues, Andrew Termestein. He was in an audit recently, and there was a mechanical powered press that you could walk under, right? It was big enough to walk into. And they said, well, the software, if it sees a signal from the light curtain that's broken, then it's not going to trip the system to close the press. So all we have to do is make sure that something stays in front of the light curtain and it's locked out. So they have this metal bar on a hinge and they slide it in front of the light curtain and lock it. And they say, well, in the software, you have a trigger and the code is written in such a way where if it sees that light curtain is a 0 instead of a 1, it's not going to run the machine. So we're good. Is that locked out? It's nowhere near locked out, right? That's horrible. That's going to kill somebody. So obviously we address that as quickly as possible. The point is, there's a lot of misunderstanding in and around digital systems, code-based logic for control of small and big machines, as well as robotics. So we're going to see that changed, I think, or at least defined better. All right. Thanks, guys.